My name is George. I'm the programs manager here at the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, and I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's program, The Defender, How Chicago's Legendary Black Newspaper Changed America, with author Ethan Michaeli, who's joining us tonight from Tel Aviv, Israel. So we're very glad to have Ethan here with us for tonight's program. Just a couple of things to mention before we get started. This program is going to be recorded, so we have a couple people joining us a little bit later, but the program will be recorded and made available to rewatch free of charge on the History Center YouTube channel, and you can find that on our main website, www.lflbhistory.org, and that program recording will go live sometime next week. And I also wanted to mention a few Zoom housekeeping options to make the program more visually accessible for everyone. In the top right corner of your screen, there is a button called View. If you hit that and select Speaker View, that'll automatically change your camera perspective to the speaker, make it a little bit easier to watch. And then you can also hit the full screen option there to fill up the entirety of your screen for the discussion. So with all that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Ethan Michaeli is an award-winning author, journalist, and university lecturer. A native of Rochester, New York, Ethan earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English Language and Literature from the University of Chicago and was a copy editor and investigative reporter at the Chicago Daily Defender from 1991 to 1996. He left the Defender to found the Residence Journal, a magazine written and produced by the tenants of Chicago's public housing developments and an affiliated not-for-profit organization, We the People Media. Ethan has served as a judge in numerous literary contests, including as chair of the 2020 Linton Prize and at the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2021. He is currently a lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy of the University of Chicago and a senior advisor for communications and development at the Golden Institute, an international not-for-profit organization collaborating with grassroots social change activists in 40 different countries. His work has been published by Oxford University Press, The Washington Post, Atlantic Magazine, The Nation, The Forward, In These Times, The Chicago Tribune, and other venues. So with that, Ethan, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, George. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you all for being together tonight virtually and for coming to hear me talk about the Chicago Defender. This is the book that I wrote in 2016 about the Chicago Defender, or that came out in 2016 about the Chicago Defender. If you're not familiar with the Defender, it is an African-American owned newspaper founded in 1905 that has an incredible record of accomplishment. The newspaper challenged Jim Crow and segregation in the South and during a period that was particularly dangerous and violent in that region. The Defender launched the Great Migration in the early part of the 20th century, the movement of hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of African Americans from the South to mainly the cities of the North. And then the Defender galvanized those migrants who came to Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh and many other cities throughout the Midwest and the Northeast and other parts of the country. The Defender galvanized those migrants into the strongest political force in the United States, swing voters who had the power to elect mayors and governors and congressmen and even presidents. Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy would not have won their elections without the support of the Chicago Defender and the African-American community that the Defender represented and galvanized with its editorials. And a young African-American politician from Chicago named Barack Obama got his start as well with the Chicago Defender's support. And it's hard to say that Obama wouldn't have become president without the Defender's launching pad, but I feel confident in repeating President Obama's words in declaring that the Defender's support was crucial to the speed and success of his presidential run so early in his career. If you didn't know these things about the Chicago Defender, it's okay. I didn't know them either until I started working there in 1991. I was a fresh graduate from the University of Chicago with a degree in English literature, as George kindly said. And I was referred to the Defender by a friend who was also a white Jewish University of Chicago graduate. And I have to admit, I didn't know anything about the newspaper or its accomplishments. And when my friend mentioned the Defender, I asked if it was a communist newspaper, between us somewhat hopefully at the time. And when he explained that it was an African-American owned newspaper, I was quite naive in those days, and I thought that there were many newspapers that were African-American owned and some that were owned by white people, and that this was really just a feature of the American journalistic landscape. I really didn't know how special the Defender was until I walked in the doors of its historic headquarters at 24th and Michigan. That's where its headquarters was in 1991, and saw a glass case in the lobby that contained issues of the newspaper going back 100 years. And what I saw there was really an alternative history of the United States, one that was more complete, frankly, than the history that I'd been taught in school, and the one that I thought was the standard history for the United States. Being at the Defender filled in the gaps, answered questions, and gave me the tools really to understand American history in an entirely new way and to understand our current situation in a new way. I left the Defender after 5.5 years to go start a magazine for and by public housing that George mentioned, the Residence Journal. And I was at the Residence Journal for 19 years, but I always dreamed of doing a book about the Chicago Defender to convey what it was like working there and what it was like to be a part of that paper. And so when the opportunity came, when I was able to convince a literary agent and then finally a publisher to put out the book about the Defender, it was really a half a lifetime's dream come true. So I have a few images that I'd like to share with you from the Defender's history, if that's okay. And then afterwards we can talk a bit about the Defender's history, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Here's our first image. Everybody can see it okay? Okay, wonderful. Here's our first image. This is from the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. And here, second from left, the gentleman wearing the spectacles is Robert Abbott, the founder of the Chicago Defender. Here he is in his days as a student at the Hampton Institute. Today, it's Hampton University. It is still one of the premier African-American institutions of higher learning in the United States. Then it was really the most important African-American institution of higher learning. And Robert Abbott was there really to learn the printing trade, but he contributed to the school's finances and contributed to his own tuition by being a member of a traveling quartet that raised money for Hampton. Now remember, these are the days before amplified music, let alone recorded and broadcast music. So this group of Abbott's, this quartet that Abbott was a part of from Hampton, was a very popular national act. They would travel around the country raising money from Hampton, performing spirituals such as songs such as "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" really powerful songs that brought their audiences to tears on many, many occasions. And when Robert Abbott came to the 1893 World's Fair, it was as a performer, but as a privileged performer, as one who had access to everywhere at the World's Fair and was able to be a part of the behind the scenes operations, in the sense that he had access to other performers, an international array of people who had come to the World's Fair to set up exhibits. I mean, people from all over the world, from the Arctic Circle really down to South America, from Japan to Brazil. There were pavilions set up all over the fairgrounds, the Midway and the lakefront area. And Robert Abbott had access to all of these folks. He had access to West African, a group of West Africans who had come and set up a village to represent West African life. All of these were extremely powerful influences on this young man, but none were more than the person I'm going to show you next, Frederick Douglass, who was at the World's Fair in 1893 at 75 years old. He was still the preeminent spokesperson for African Americans at this juncture, and he was a leader in terms of leading African Americans in this new situation after the Civil War. In the wake of the Civil War, African Americans were promised many things that were not delivered. And Frederick Douglass was on the front lines of fighting for these things, as he had been for decades and decades. If you remember, Frederick Douglass was someone who had been born enslaved, but escaped from enslavement as a young man, and became a preeminent spokesperson for the abolition movement before he became an advocate for the Union, a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln's, later an international diplomat to Haiti. He was an experienced and incredible speaker, and Robert Abbott got to see him and hear him, and especially hear him and his protege, Ida B. Wells, talk about newspapers as being the way to get the masses organized, to get African Americans informed and ready to take their place on not just the American stage, but the world stage. Robert Abbott came out of the Hampton Institute with an incredible knowledge of the latest printing technology. Here is the latest printing technology. This is a photograph of the Defender's printing room a few years later, but you can see the linotype machines, these kind of early typewriter type devices that were a revolution in printing. Before these types of devices were available on a mass level, newspapers, if you saw them, were really just broadsheets with long lines of type, undistinguished by headlines, photographs, sections. All of these innovations were modern technologies that were deployed at first by people like Hearst and Pulitzer, but later they were available to just about everybody. And you could go with a very small investment and begin to produce very professional looking newspapers that had all sorts of bells and whistles to attract readers. Headlines, photographs, different sections for sports and news and editorial. These were all ways to get the average reader engaged. And newspapers, which had been really kind of on the level of academic journals in the sense that they were seldom published, very expensive, and available really to elite audiences, became something that were available to the masses. Robert Abbott took this concept to African Americans and began to build a publication that was a nationwide communications vehicle for African Americans. He worked with people like these folks, the Pullman porters, who were the valets, the famed valets of the interstate railroads and the intrastate railroads as well. And these were African-American men who had a rare access to travel in those days, the ability to move about the country freely, which was difficult, especially in the segregated South. There is a kind of mythology about the Pullman porters and their partnership with the Defender that imagines that the Pullman porters would take bundles of the newspaper and kind of toss them out to people all over the United States. In fact, I think it's important to make the correction and say that what the Pullman porters really did for the Defender was to sell subscriptions to the paper. If you can imagine a person in, let's say, a small southern town, a small farmer or a small business owner or a sharecropper, in other words, someone who works very hard for their income, buying a newspaper from a man on a train for $1 a year, a hard-earned dollar, that was a bond that Robert Abbott and the staff at the Defender considered sacrosanct. They did absolutely everything to get that paper out on time every week. The Defender was published every week in those days, and it was a paper that was sent out through the mail around the country. And Robert Abbott really often went without food or clothing in the early days of the Defender, just to make sure that that paper would have paper and ink and get out to the readers on time. He was that dedicated, and that dedication was rewarded with loyalty of a mass of readers that had never embraced an African-American newspaper before. A lot of it was due to the Pullman porters and their efforts on behalf of the paper. And the porters were also reporters and information gatherers, and even kind of provided a wire service for the Defender, a kind of a wire service in the sense that they brought newspapers from around the country back to the newspaper in Chicago, the newspaper's headquarters in Chicago, so that Abbott could go through them for information that was pertinent to the readership of the Defender. Here's a photo of or an image from the 1910 Defender edition that covered a boxing match between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries, who was billed as the Great White Hope. Jack Johnson was the first African-American to win the heavyweight championship, and he did so in Reno, Nevada, before an all-white audience, or a nearly all-white audience of thousands under the blazing sun. He defeated a past champion of boxing and really gave African-Americans everywhere a moment of pride. Because there was quite a bit of gambling, won a lot of people, including a lot of people in Chicago who bet on the hometown fighter. He won them a lot of money. Jack Johnson, for the Defender, however, was a symbol and an ally who they were able to make a regular headline and a regular attention grabber from their readers. This is a cartoon from the Defender's 1910 edition covering the Johnson-Jeffries fight. And cartoons in those days were a very powerful and different way of engaging readers, one that hadn't been done before. I think you can see the different imagery here that's very powerfully conveys Johnson as a kind of Buddha-like figure, one of statuesque physique and one of a really great nobility. This is in great contrast to how he was portrayed in many of the other newspapers, the white-owned newspapers around the country. You can see that the audience is actually made up of crows, as in the Jim Crow crows. And Jeffries is backed by evil-looking spirits and an evil-looking devil wearing an Uncle Sam uniform. All of these show the challenges that Johnson had to face and that he was courageously battling against. And the Defender celebrated Johnson really as a champion in this way. The cartoon was a powerful way to bring in readers and engage them on this in this mission. You can see here other innovations that the Defender used to get its readers. Yes, there's the prurient headline at the top, where it talks about a domestic squabble that really went wrong. But if you look below that headline, you can see a photograph that talks about the Exodus. This is using a biblical term to describe the Great Migration, to the very beginning of this movement of African Americans from the South to the North. Today, we sometimes are presented the Great Migration as something that had a mainly economic motivation. In other words, that people were coming to get better jobs in the North. That was true to an extent, but especially early on, Robert Abbott did not, for example, support the migration of people from the South to the North because unions in the North discriminated. Jobs were available in the South, frankly, just as they were in the North. And there were racist practices among Northerners as well. But what Robert Abbott saw was that when many African-American workers left in one time from the South, it actually damaged the South's economy and gave African-Americans new leverage as desired workers in the workforce. Suddenly, newspapers that had been calling for the expulsion or the incarceration of masses of African Americans were demanding that African Americans stay in the region, and were talking about different ways to entice them to stay in the region. Calling it an exodus for the Defender was a way of really getting people motivated and focused on the migration as a political tool, in other words, as a way to strike back against Jim Crow and the South. And that's what really made it so powerful. It wasn't just a way of getting a better job for your future. It was also a way of damaging the segregationists in the South. Here's a photo of Robert Abbott from a little bit later in the 1920s. This is an image that I just absolutely love, because you can see that it's Abbott with the young men who distributed the newspaper. And you can't fake the looks of adulation on the faces of these young men. Many of you, because this is a history organization, I'm sure that many of you either knew or heard of or saw or heard interviews with Dr. Timuel Black, who passed away a few years ago at over the age of 100. Well, Dr. Black was one of these young men. He wasn't necessarily one of the young men in the photograph. He did look at this photograph, but his eyesight had faded a bit by the time I was interviewing him, and he wasn't sure if he was one of the young men in this photograph. But he was a newsboy at the Defender, and he was someone who actually assisted his older brother Walter in distributing the newspapers, and he remembered Robert Abbott, and he remembered Robert Abbott as this person of great imagery, as he described it. When I asked Dr. Black to explain what he meant by someone of great imagery, he said that while Robert Abbott didn't have a great speaking voice, he wasn't very smooth with his wordplay. He had a strong Southern accent from his upbringing in Georgia, and was not a tall, imposing figure either. He had an incredible presence because he was someone who was so committed to the community. He had become a millionaire by the 1920s. The Defender's newspaper had surged into the hundreds of thousands. And he was sought after by presidents and politicians at every level for his support. But he continued to come to the newspaper every day. He continued to meet with these young men every day. He continued to show them that it was possible for them to make it just like he had made it. He was a capitalist. He was someone who believed in free enterprise and in business and in success. And he wanted to motivate these young men to follow in his footsteps. Here's an image from the 1919 race riot in Chicago. This was a formative moment, not just for the city, but also for the newspaper. For the city, this was the first time that in the aftermath of the 1919 race riots, segregation really took hold in the city for the first time. Before the 1919 race riots, African Americans lived in a section of the South Side, but there was no street in that section that was more than 50% African American. There were many other people that lived on the same streets and were neighbors with African Americans, and relations were fairly amicable. But the 1919 race riot, in which there were white gangs that came toward African-American residents and toward African-American areas, toward places where African-Americans lived. The white gangs came and terrorized African-American neighborhoods in this way. African-American soldiers from World War I formed a perimeter around the neighborhood to protect it. Eventually, the National Guard came in to enforce that perimeter. And at the end, what you had was a stalemate in which African Americans were living in one part of the city. Those that had lived in other parts of the city had effectively been chased out. And that section of the South Side became the nucleus of an African American community that, while segregated, expanded, prospered, and grew until it really covered all of the South Side of the city, and then expanded into the West Side as well. For the Defender, the 1919 race riot was a formative moment in that Robert Abbott understood afterwards that he could not rely on any other institution, especially any white printers, which he had previously relied on. He built his own plant, his own headquarters. You can see the structure here. It's still standing on 35th Street. It's a beautiful building. It's now condominiums at 35th in Indiana. But this building housed Robert Abbott's printing press as well, something that he was, I think I have a photo of that next. Yes, something that he was incredibly proud of. It was the only African-American owned newspaper at the time that owned its own printing press. It was a modern, technologically advanced machine or set of machines that really catapulted the Defender into the first rank of publications. And Robert Abbott used to come in at night after everyone had gone home for the day, just to kind of look at the machine and admire it. And you can see here that the principles of another institution that Robert Abbott built, which was the Bud Billiken Parade. If you are familiar with the Billiken Parade, it takes place the second Saturday in August every year, close to back to school time, and it's a back to school parade. Hundreds of thousands of people go every year. It draws people from all over the United States as a really one-of-a-kind celebration. The food is incredible too. There are no end of vendors of everything you can imagine all along the way. I usually go with a few dollars and some hunger to try to really enjoy the day. And you can see here in this photograph, Mr. Abbott is already in the second row there, at the end of the second row. Mr. Abbott is suffering from liver disease and is looking for people that he can turn over duties at the newspaper to. Standing next to him is his nephew, John Sengstack, who would eventually take over the newspaper. And if you can follow Mr. Sengstack's gaze, you can see that he's looking at a gentleman who is on the second row, second from left. That's a gentleman named Nathan McGill, who was the managing editor of the newspaper, the general manager of the newspaper, and the general counsel of the newspaper as well. And he and Mr. Sengstack had a dispute over the finances of the newspaper. So there was a battle for years over the succession of the paper. But eventually Mr. Sengstack came to lead it. One other person I'd like to show in this photograph is here in the middle of the top row. The smiling gentleman in the excellent suit is Duke Ellington, the jazz musician, who was a headliner at the Bud Billiken Parade. Then, as now, the Bud Billiken Parade draws the finest musicians, the most popular celebrities of the moment. And the parade really is a showcase for these folks to reach really the base community in Chicago that is all important in building a national reputation. In 1940, Robert Abbott passed away, and just as in the photograph with the young men distributing the newspaper, you also see the adulation in the faces of these men who are the newspaper reporters and editors at the Defender. They were all people, there were no schools at that time to train African-American journalists, so all of them had been trained at the Defender. Many of them had been trained by Robert Abbott personally. They were all personally very grateful to Robert Abbott for giving them the chance to be journalists and to become nationally known figures for their journalism, and really celebrated as heroes in many parts of the African-American community. This young man here is John Sengstack, Robert Abbott's nephew, after he's taken over the Defender. John Sengstack had a different style. He was more, had plans to make innovations in the paper, to really bring new technologies to the newspaper, to make the Defender into a powerhouse. He started national editions. He started local branches of the Defender, such as the Tri-State Defender in Memphis, the Michigan Chronicle in Detroit, and he took over other African-American newspapers when they fell on hard times. He bought the Pittsburgh Courier and other publications, and made the Defender into a newspaper hub that was really getting information out in different ways, in different to different audiences all over the United States. And John Sengstack also did something else. He brought the Defender over from the Republican Party, which Robert Abbott supported, to the Democratic Party. You may know that African Americans from the Civil War on were strong supporters of the Republican Party, which of course was founded to end slavery, out of homage to Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant and other presidents. African Americans were a strong base for the Republican Party. But with Roosevelt and the New Deal, with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, John Sengstack saw an opportunity for African Americans to switch to the Democratic Party. He was one of the main leaders of that switch, and that was a move that gave him great leverage over the federal government. He was someone who confronted this gentleman, Francis Biddle, the U.S. Attorney General. Francis Biddle, Roosevelt's Attorney General, threatened to shut down the Black press for sedition during World War II. He felt that the Black press, by criticizing segregation in the U.S. Army, was impairing the war effort. And Biddle and Sengstack had a fiery meeting in which Biddle threatened to use the FBI and use the sedition laws to shutter the Defender. Sengstack called his bluff and told him to do it, but told him to try understand that the African American newspapers we're fighting segregation, and we're going to continue fighting segregation even if the federal government intervened. Biddle was so impressed by Sengstac's approach that they actually began a partnership, and Biddle became a very reliable ally to Sengstack in doing things like bringing the first African American into the White House press corps, Harry McAlpin. You can see here also that the approach that John Sengstack took during World War II to get African Americans involved in the war effort was really to go for the intellect. He engaged writers like Langston Hughes to go through the arguments and to show that there was a need really for African Americans to participate in the American war effort, even though the United States was far from perfect as a standard bearer for freedom and democracy. African Americans knew that they were fighting for a country that continued to segregate them, that continued to segregate them in the military and throughout the South. But they understood that the risk and the threat from the Nazis and from the imperialists in Japan was strong enough that there was a need for them to participate. And the Defender felt that this was a cause that they could support in this intellectual way. By engaging writers like Langston Hughes, they felt that they were contributing to the war effort in the most significant way possible that the Black press could. After the war was over and after Franklin Roosevelt had passed away, however, the Defender and the African American community understood that they had political leverage and that in fact the Democratic Party and the United States owed them a debt of gratitude. So when you see African Americans supporting someone like Harry Truman in 1948, you can understand that a lot of that was because Truman promised to do things to help the African American community. In particular, Truman ordered the integration of the US military. He did that with the strong urging of John Sengstack from the Chicago Defender. And in fact, President Truman put Mr. Sengstack on the commission that was charged with integrating the US Armed Forces. That was Mr. Sengstack's first foray into the upper echelons of government decision-making. And you can see here that Mr. Sengstack had his own take on Harry Truman's famous headline. Just as Truman had liked to make fun of the headline that proclaimed the headline in the Chicago Tribune that falsely proclaimed his opponent the winner. The Defender liked to say, "We told you so," when it came to predicting Truman's election. Now, of course, Truman would not have won without the Defender's all-out support. It was really African American votes in Illinois and Ohio and a few other states that put Truman over in 1948. Here you can see the gratitude that former President Truman is showing John Sengstack during the 1956 Bud Billiken Parade. President Truman is already out of office, but he still felt that it was important enough to come back to Chicago, come back for a public appearance at the Billiken Parade to express his gratitude to Mr. Sengstack for his victory. You can also see that Mayor Richard J. Daley is sitting next to Mr. Sengstack, and you can see that the crowds are cheering Mayor Daley. That's because Daley was elected in the earlier the year before, with very strong support from the African American community, and he had pledged that he would be loyal to the African American community as well. So this was very early on in Mayor Daley's career, and the Billiken Parade became a showcase for him as well, and one that he made use of for many years afterwards. The Defender also participated in many of the key moments in the newspaper's history. Here's one of the Defender's reporters facing down a mob in Little Rock. This was a moment that was televised, where people around the country saw one of the Defender's reporters being attacked by the mob and struck. The reporter displayed great dignity and was, although he was severely injured by the mob, his dignity and resilience in the face of their brutality became a national symbol for the civil rights movement. It became part of the motivation for Little Rock and the integration of schools that took place there at that time. This was something that the Defender contributed to in somewhat of a tragic way. Here you can see Mr. Sengstack in 1960 in Robert F. Kennedy's office. Mr. Sengstack liked, and I should say that in the 1990s, I had the privilege of working for Mr. Sengstack during the final years that he was at the newspaper. He continued to tell us during those days that he had walk-in privileges at the White House during the Kennedy and Johnson years because the Defender's support had been so critical, and President Kennedy and Truman both considered him one of their essential advisors. This is a photograph by Mr. Sengstack's son, Bobby Sengstack, who, in addition to being a great journalist and a great person, was an amazing photographer. And many of the photographs that you see of Martin Luther King, especially the ones from Chicago during these moments that Dr. King was in the city, come from Bobby Sengstack. You've seen Bobby Sengstack's photos in many of the documentaries. Because of his role at the Defender, he had unparalleled access to Dr. King and was really someone who had captured moments in Dr. King's work that are precious to us now, so many years later. This is a photograph from the 1968 Billiken Parade, just to, again, show off to you the types of celebrities that were in the parade. This is Muhammad Ali and James Brown, of course. This is a photograph from the Defender in 1983, when the newspaper was a moral voice in the politically charged election in which Harold Washington became Chicago's first African-American mayor. Here he is in front of the Robert Taylor Homes public housing development, in which people really came out to celebrate Harold's candidacy. And the Defender was there to capture and celebrate the moment, but also to serve as a moral voice, criticizing the racism that the Washington campaign faced, but also there to hold the Washington administration, once Harold Washington was installed as mayor, to hold them accountable for their promises to the community. And here's the Defender's early coverage of Barack Obama at the Billiken Parade. You can see future President Obama. Here he's just running for the U.S. Senate, but here you can see at this moment, State Senator Obama leading a sizable group at the Billiken Parade. If you read President Obama's own memoirs, as well as reports from that time, you'll know that when he first was elected to state office, Obama did not know that the Billiken Parade was a very important event for politicians, but he quickly learned, and you can see that he did a great job of putting together a team for this Billiken Parade. He came to understand that the parade was absolutely essential for electoral office in this state. And I just want to finish my slideshow by telling you that, and we can go to questions afterwards. I just want to finish the slideshow by saying that the Defender is still around. It is still an online news source. It stopped publishing in print a few years ago. but it's still around, it's still there, and I think it will continue to be a vital news source for the foreseeable future. Sadly, it will continue to be a news source because we need a defender. We need an African American owned and controlled news source that looks at information and gets out information to an African American audience, and that holds other news organizations and news outlets accountable.
I've been doing a lot of family history,
Yeah.
and I was born in rural Tennessee, and a lot of my family moved to Chicago, moved to, all great migration stories. But I've been really having a difficult time trying to look through the Defender's archives. What is the best place to go for that? And is most of it behind a paywall?
No, actually, first of all, thank you very much for this question, Sam, correct?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your question, because it gives me the opportunity to mention that access to not every single issue, but almost every single issue of the Defender from 1908 to fairly current are available through the Chicago Public Library. PDF editions, searchable PDF editions are available for the newspaper up through the thousands, I believe. And then after that, you can find links to other things, and almost everything is there. The Chicago Public Library offers the papers in PDF format, so you can actually look at the newspapers and flip through the pages virtually. And as I said, you can search them. So I would advise searching for, your family's name, try different spellings, and try different names. And if there was ever anyone in your family who the Defender was known for recording the quotidian activities of its readers, which is to say that where the great journalist African-American journalist Vernon Jarrett once said that the Defender recorded all the events that the white newspapers ignored, the weddings and graduations and other types of accomplishments that people that had. So I really hope that your search is fruitful. It also gives me an opportunity to say that I have a website called it's ethanmichaeli.com, and please contact me there and let me know how it goes, and let me know if you need help. I'm happy to do that. I love those archives, and I look through them a lot anyway, so it's fun for me to help other people do that. Sure. That you're very welcome, Sam. Who's next?
Thank you for that, Sam. Jim asks the question, what other efforts were there to suppress the Chicago Defender in its history?
There were many efforts to suppress the Defender. There were efforts to the website. I see a question from Teresa. I'll just say is my name, Ethan Michaeli. It looks like Ethan Michaeli, but my first name is pronounced Eitan. It looks like ethanmichaeli.com. Or you can just Google the Defender, copy my name, and put that in the browser at put.com. You can do all the multiple ways to get to me that way. Oh, thank you. That was even better. George put the website address in the chat. So there were multiple efforts to suppress the Defender. There were occasional efforts from postal officials to seize the paper. Those often came to naught because regional postal officials were countermanded by higher ups in the federal government. And there were efforts early on, even from Southern town. One Southern town sent Pinkerton detectives to the defender's offices to try to arrest Robert Abbott and take him back down to Georgia. But that was, even at that time, by that date, 1910, the African-American community had grown so strong that the Pinkertons were basically ejected from the community, that this was a community that by 1910 had African-American police officers, African-American National Guardsmen, African-American lawyers, African-American political representatives. All of these folks came to Robert Abbott's aid in his office, which was really a converted apartment in those days. All of them came to Robert Abbott's aid and ejected the Pinkertons from that part of the town and eventually from the city. The one I also mentioned, just because it's so odd, that the segregationists in the South would take all sorts of measures, would abuse people in many different ways, and were censorious wherever they could be, but they were afraid of messing with the US mail. So the defender was usually sent all over the South safely, simply by being inserted in a brown paper bag. Yeah. Okay. Who's next?
Thank you again, Jim. Anne asks, can you please elaborate further about how history has been historically portrayed from other vantage points, mainly the white perspective?
How history has been portrayed?
How history has been portrayed potentially in reference to the defender, or those against the defender, maybe, if I'm reading it correctly.
Well, I guess that if I understand the question properly, I think the Defender as a publication centered the struggle for civil rights as the main theme of American history, which is a way of understanding American history that I agree with, frankly. When you look back from the Revolution through the Civil War, through our current era, the question of whether civil rights will be allocated to all Americans is one that is the central question of American history. And I think the Defender does has kept that at in the prominent role, whereas other versions of American history tend to minimize the struggle for civil rights, or regard it as something that is already complete, or regarded as one of the less, I've even seen some narratives that would try to eliminate or really marginalize the struggle for civil rights, and I think that's erroneous. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Next question we have is from John, who asks, like a multi-part question here. It says, what caused you to write the book? How long did it take? And what would you do differently for your next book?
The book took 6 years to write. It was, I had, it was difficult to write a book in just over that extensive period of time. But it was also difficult to do. I had various other jobs and activities that during those years. So what really I aim to do now, when I'm working on a third book now, my second book is called 12 Tribes, Promise and Peril in the New Israel, and it's about modern Israel, where I am right now. And my third book, which is under contract, is going to be called An Extraordinary, under contract with Henry Holt and Company, is going to be, the book will be called An Extraordinary Alliance, How Blacks and Jews Together Saved American Democracy. And my rule for this book is that I'm not going to work on anything else while I'm working on this book. I'm just going to focus on this and get this done. And I'm saying that also in case my editor is listening, so that she knows that I'm not doing anything else except for working on this book 24/7.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have any other questions? While anyone's taking the time to type out a question, I just want to say a few concluding remarks for tonight's presentation. Ethan, thank you immensely for such an insightful journey into your story with the Defender and sharing the some of the knowledge from your book. I did want to make a couple concluding remarks. I wanted to mention virtual programming through the History Center continues to be made possible by the generous donations by Madeline B. Dugan and Mark Saran. So Maddie and Mark, thank you for continuing to support virtual programming. I also wanted to mention that this program is in supplementation of our current exhibit, Deeply Rooted in Rising High, African American Experiences in Lake Forest, which is currently on display at the History Center in Lake Forest, Illinois. It'll be on display through the end of November. So if you haven't seen the exhibit yet, come by and come take a look at it. And we have a couple other programs in store before the exhibition runs its course, a few of which are already listed for registration on our main website. So we have coming up on September 28th, a partnership with Lewis University for a program and temporary exhibit titled 38 Miles North and South from Chicago, which is a comparative look at African American history in Lake Forest and Joliet. Then we also have a program coming up in October in partnership with the Glencoe Historical Society on Glencoe's Black heritage. We'll have staff members from the Glencoe Historical Society speaking at the History Center on their exhibition that's currently on display. And then once again, as I mentioned, this program will be recorded and made available to watch sometime next week. And thank you to all of our current History Center members here in the audience this evening. All programming at the History Center would not be possible without your continued dedication and support. So with that, Ethan, thank you once again. Let me check to make sure one more. We have no questions. Nope, no questions. So Ethan, thank you again. We wish you good night. And for all of us, from all of us here at the History Center, until next time, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, everybody.